Welcome to Garden Views, interesting conversations with interesting people who have done and or are doing interesting things. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome everyone to Garden Views, and we're having a return guest today. For those of you who listen to all of my shows, this is a different PJ than the one you're used to. This is Professor PJ Blount. He is at the University of Durham in the UK, not Durham, North Carolina. Everyone, we're talking about England. And he is an assistant professor of space law. He visited with us once before on settling in space. And then he was at the University of Cardiff, or Cardiff University back then. And he just moved. He's only there for like a week and a half, and he's made time for us. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us on the show.
Happy to be back.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. And this time we're going to talk about security in space. I'm sure we'll get into things like dual use and phasers on stun and Jewish space lasers. So yeah, let's go.
Sounds great.
Okay, good. So I guess I have to ask you, where do we start? What are the operating principles, laws, treaties, if any, on security in space?
So I think the place that you start, and I am a lawyer, so I come at this from a legal perspective, is really, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the space age, there was this moment where, how to phrase this? Well, so the United States was really concerned about how this was all going to unfold. And so that's when they decided they would pitch their first satellite launch as part of the International Geophysical Year. And they were making it very clear that this was going to be a scientific launch, a peaceful launch, and they wanted to frame space in that way. The Soviets, literally 2 weeks after the U.S. announced, said the same thing. We're going to do this as a peaceful launch. And so one of the things that you get at the very, very beginning is this notion that space is going to be for peaceful purposes, and it becomes a phrase that is ubiquitous, right? You'll find it in diplomatic statements from every country in the world. It's in the name of the UN committee, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So it is this almost like a grun norm for space. It's for peaceful purposes, for peaceful uses. But the question is then, what does that mean, right? What are we talking about? And at the beginning, there was this notion, the U.S. kind of pushed at the beginning that this was going to be non-military. And then they kind of backed off of that, and they thought, hey, we've got these wonderful, remote sensing satellites that we're going to do. So maybe we should just go with this notion of non-aggressive. At which point the Soviets were like, no, it's non-military. It's non-military. And then the Soviets got some cool technology, and they were like, oh yeah, maybe it's non-aggressive. And so we're kind of left in this place where it certainly doesn't mean non-military, but we don't know where it sits on the spectrum of non-aggressive to militarized or to weaponized. And so I think that's the sort of the central problem that we face.
Well, that is quite a central problem. And I have used this example before on the show with other guests, and maybe with you last time. I mean, we all grew up watching police shows. Some people probably still do. And, oftentimes on the side of the squad car, usually in Los Angeles, it would say protect and to serve. And the police have firearms and other, offensive weapons, which can also be defensive. And, and in other forms of conflict, there's a difference between policing and police actions versus warfare. That seems to me to be one of the things that could easily be a blurred line.
Yeah, I mean, so what essentially you get is you fall back to the UN Charter, right? So if we take that there's this notion of spaces for peaceful purposes, you can find your baseline for what that means in the UN Charter. And the UN Charter says that we're not going to use force, right? That you have a right to self-defense. So this notion of aggressive force is illegal, but you do have a right to defend yourself, right? Which is why you still get to have a military, and you still get to have, fun toys, weapons and missiles and stuff. And so that's sort of our baseline for what this might mean. But because they used a different phrase in space law, this notion of peaceful purposes, there is the potential that this might mean something more than that, right? That, I've argued before that potentially it means non-aggressive plus sort of what's in the Outer Space Treaty, right? This other normative content. But what we see in very specifically Article 4 says that we're not going to put nuclear weapons in space, but it completely leaves out any other type of weapon from its prohibition. So by that lack of inclusion, right, those types of weapons are technically allowed in space. Now, we have seen great restraint from states over time in deploying those types of weapons, and there are lots of reasons for that. But it's not law that keeps them from doing that. It's restraint based on strategy and other dynamics of the domain.
I have a question just popped into my head. And I don't know that you know the answer to this, but we have a lot of private actors going into space. I'm sure that they're heavily regulated, but I don't know how regulated. I mean, I don't want to name any particular company, so just say Jeffx. Has something in my payload. I have whatever. I have a space laser. It's an atheist space laser, but it's a space laser or a non-denominational space laser. And I fly it up there through Jeffx, which, just let's just say for the sake of argument so that no particular state can be impugned here. Somehow I built myself a giant rig in the middle of international waters, and I was able to launch it from there. I know that technologically it's not possible right now. I just want to keep it from the launching state. This is an international charter. It doesn't necessarily bind private companies, does it? I mean, I know this is a sort of far-fetched thing. I have a more probably relevant question for you, and that is, and you can answer it second, but that is exactly how binding is the UN Charter on countries? I mean, there's a million conflicts. Well, not a million, but there's dozens of conflicts all over, including shooting wars. So obviously the UN Charter is something of a suggestion rather than ironclad. So I don't know which of those you want to pick up first.
Yeah, boy. So I'll start with the first one. Right? I mean, if you somehow, as a person, go out and you build something that ocean used to launch without a state being able to get its jurisdictional hooks on you, I mean, there's not much that anyone can do, right? You have essentially thwarted the jurisdiction of any state. But if you look in real terms, right, let's say that you were doing this from the U.S., right? The FAA is going to do a payload review. They're doing that payload review for health and safety reasons, right? And so when they go in, and also for ensuring that you comply with international obligations, when they go and look at your payload and they see the big non-denominational space laser that is not fulfilling any other purpose than for destructive things, they're going to disallow you from launching that into space. Now, that said, right, we can go to different cases. We don't need a non-denominational space laser. Astroscale is putting together technology that will go up and rendezvous with a spacecraft and potentially fix it or potentially deorbit it, right? That's just a step away from an ASAT weapon. And so we have to actually begin to think about how are we going to deal with those technologies, right? We want Astroscale to have a good business, right? We want them to go able to remove debris. We also don't want the state that licenses them to suddenly act as though they have a space weapon, and we don't want other states to be threatened by this technology. And so there's a lot of ground that has to be charted there. The question. So this is the big one in international law, right? This is international law.
Right.
And there are lots of different answers to this, and there's it's literally something that international lawyers fight about all the time. Right? My particular stance on it is, look, international law is law. If you can accept that law doesn't look always like you're used to law looking, right? We're used to law looking like police and courts and a legislature and an executive, and that's not how international law works. International law is, I'll give you the way that I teach it, right? Which is my roommate's theory of international law. right? We've all lived with roommates. You may have lived in a house with 4 roommates, right? There were rules in that house that you'd agreed on. Things like don't smoke in the living room. And if one of your roommates came home drunk and smoked in the living room, well, you have options, right? Those options are you can exercise, sorry, it's been a long day. What is the word that I'm looking for there? Don't worry about it. So you ostracize. Thank you. You can ostracize them. So you can ignore them, right? You can treat them as though they've done something bad, right? This is your rogue state. We're not going to talk to you. You can sanction them, right? You and the other roommates can make them pay the TV bill or the internet bill or something like that.
Eat their cereal.
Yeah, you can take away. Yeah, you need their cereal. You could take away aid, right? They might not get the leftovers that you were going to give them, or something like that. Or you can fight them, right? You can have a war. But these are rules that you have, but they're self-enforcing, and this is the problem in international law: is that it is self-enforcing. So the UN Charter does take the stance that war and aggression is illegal. We know that it hasn't stopped war and aggression, but you also know that in your own domestic system that murder is illegal. That murder statute hasn't stopped murder from happening, right? That's the law. But international law is a lot more fluid, and it's a lot more difficult to enforce, and that is a problem for international law. It is the weak spot in international law, but I don't know that it necessarily makes it not the law.
There's also a bright line in there, and I'm not known for my bright lines or my silver linings. That's what I'm trying to look for. Is that in my example of Jeffx, it's a private company. It can enter into contract, or various governments can enter into contract with it to say you're not going to do this or else. And actually, those contracts are probably more easily enforceable than international law by the unwilling. Or by the lazy or not motivated, but a contract is more easily enforced. So, maybe if Jeff, that's me, the evil CEO, forms Jeffx and acquires all this technology, maybe the big players or the UN itself would enter into a contract with me and bind me that way and, require some security or whatnot. Doesn't help our bigger question, because most of the players probably will be states, at least in the near term. But I think that's about as good an answer as you can give. It's just like everything else. You hope for sanctions, you hope for a coalition, you freeze accounts, whatever it is that we see in, international conflicts. Today is September 11th, 2024. It's an anniversary of something very, tragic. But right now there's a number of wars and there's sanctions against several countries, and some are more effective than others. I suspect it would be the same. Although I would think in space, there probably has to be a little bit more cooperation, just because it's so easy for things to go wrong that, the cosmonauts might need to be rescued by the astronauts, and the astronauts might need to be rescued by the cosmonauts. And it becomes sort of the law of the sea out there, where it doesn't matter if you were friend or foe, you rescue somebody that's out there in the ocean.
Yeah, when I was saying earlier, that we've seen a great deal of restraint on states actually putting weapons up there into space. I think this is one of the reasons, right? The Soviets and the U.S. consistently kind of pursued different ASAT weapons. One of my favorite space weapons, right? The Soviets on their Salyut space station put a gun up on it. They had like a gun turret and an actual physical gun, and they fired it once, right? They were about to be commissioned. They took everybody off of it, and they fired it once. And immediately they were like, "Well, those are really bad idea because of the physics of it. Right? It's essentially a thruster on your space station. But this restraint, and a guy named James Clay Maltz actually argues this in a book called the Politics of Space Security. That restraint was very much built around this notion of how the environment works, and this notion that we need to be a bit more cooperative in that area in order to maintain that environment. And so that has led to this restraint. In fact, in the 80s, right, in around 82 or 83, the Soviets just announced without any prodding, they said, we're putting a moratorium on testing ASATs. We think that this is bad for space and we're not going to do it anymore. And the US was the ones, we were like, oh yeah, well, yeah, you guys do that. We're going to try it. We're going to keep trying. And eventually in 86, the US did it. I forget, I think it was I want to say Solar Winds, but that's a hack. Solar something satellite, and it was shot down with an air-to-space missile, and Congress actually pulled the plug on it. They said, we're not going to test this unless the Soviets break their moratorium. And that moratorium actually held until 2007 when the Chinese did it. And so we've seen this new erosion of that restraint since 2007, with 4 states having tested ASATs at this point.
What's an ASAT?
Sorry, an anti-satellite weapon.
Okay. All right.
And so that can be a whole gamut of different things.
Okay. That was my next question now.
Well, when you say anti-satellite, it's anything if you go with like the military definition, anything that can deny or degrade a satellite, right? So the classic one is a kinetic ASAT, where you fire a missile there and you blow the thing up. It goes all the way down to like a dazzling, right? When you just shoot a laser or a sensing satellite, and that sensor can't pick up the thing that it's trying to pick, right? So that is denying the capability. We are less concerned with the dazzling example, which is non-permanent damage. But as you move up that spectrum towards permanent damage, we become more and more concerned for lots of different reasons. But kinetic ASATs in particular create large debris fields, and large debris fields are bad for space.
Right. Yeah, it's getting crowded up there, and it doesn't take a lot to cause a lot of damage. I mean, the things move at 10,000 miles an hour or something like that, where a penny or a pebble can easily destroy or wreak havoc on a fairly significant satellite or vessel.
Oh yeah, so a warhead on the tip of a missile really does it.
Now, I think you said in 2007 the Chinese did something, but it got a little scratchy there. What did the Chinese do?
So in 2007, China, out of nowhere, well, it's sort of out of nowhere to the press. There is reports that the U.S. knew this was coming. They launched a ground-to-space missile, and they blew up a weather satellite, a defunct weather satellite, belonged to them. It was called FY-1C, and so this is the first ASAT test in what we might call the contemporary or modern era, right? Since 1986, when the U.S. did that one. And so, there's a lot of speculation as to why they did this. China, at Copious, takes a strong position that you shouldn't do these things. And then they did this, right? And so, one of the theories there is that just different parts of the government weren't talking to each other. And so nobody kind of realized that one part of the government was going to do this and nobody else knew, and all these different things. I think that it's pretty clear as why they did it, right? If you look at the flashpoint between the United States and China, it's Taiwan. For the United States to intervene there, the United States needs to be able to communicate with naval ships that are forward deployed in the Pacific Ocean. They're going to depend on satellite. China testing an ASAT is not saying we can take out your whole system, but it's saying that we can take you out in a theater of battle. And it was essentially, in my opinion, a signal to the United States that we have this capability. To kind of follow up on that narrative, in 2008, then the United States has a spy satellite, USA 193, that is tumbling. It's not been functional for years, and it's going to re-enter orbit. And the United States, in Operation Burt Frost, is like, oh, well, we can show China that we have this capability too. And we use a sea-to-space missile to take this out in a very low orbit. And what's interesting about the United States is they did full court press on informing the international community beforehand, right? I put together a documents book when this happened, right? There there were Federal Emergency Management Agency briefings on what to do if a hydrazine tank landed in your city, right? The CDC issued things on how to deal with hydrazine. They went and briefed multiple UN agencies on this. They held a huge briefing where they talked about Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, and the whole point of this was to normatively set USA 193 apart from what China did. Nevertheless, US's goal was to show China we had it too. Interesting here is, for me at least, is the strategy part. China doesn't care because China's not looking to forward deploy to the US. China, if they're going to be in a conflict with the US, is going to be their own mainland, where they have their own infrastructure, where they're not depending on space in the same way as their adversary. And so that signaling doesn't impress them much. To paraphrase Reba, I forget who said that. But so then we get
Okay.
just kind of kind of on to the story. In 2019, here's where my dates are going to get fuzzy because I'm tired. India does it, right? What's India signaling? Well, India is signaling to China that we have this because they're having border disputes, and this is over, across the Himalayas. And so that is a place where China is likely depending on satellites. And then, of course, Russia does it in, I think, 2020. And that's probably signaling to the US that they've got that capability. So we've had this sort of rash of 4 tests in the last decade and a half.
Wow. Well, it's almost an escalation, but I guess arguably it's not. But I guess we're showing you ours, so we have it. Which I guess is sort of consistent with mutual assured destruction, but isn't really great for we're keeping space out of the combat zone. I mean, it's sort of signaling we can all put space in the combat zone. Let's just go back to the UN Charter, and I'm not going to ask you anything too theoretical on enforcement. How far out into space does it extend? I mean, is it our atmosphere, the magnetosphere? Is it the entire solar system? Is it just space, the entirety of the final frontier?
So I think that there's 2 ways to answer this, right? One is the Outer Space Treaty, Article 3, makes this very clear statement that international law is going to apply. I forget the exact wording at this moment, whether it's going to apply in space, but international law applies. But I don't think that we necessarily should think about international law being spatial in that sense. And spatial is in space, but spatial is in sort of the area around you. Because what international law is intended to do is to create a legal regime for the relationships between and among states. And so as long as states are having relationships, it doesn't matter where they're having those, international law is going to be applicable to those relationships, right? And this is something that we kind of got into in the space settlement episode, which was, at what point is that entity in space no longer a state and sort of extracted themselves from this earthbound law. But I would say that, look, if Dubai and Andorra are orbiting satellites around Jupiter and they're coming into conflict, international law is going to apply to that. And it's not because international law has been applied to all territory of space. It's because 2 states are having an interaction there, and that is what international law applies to.
Okay, so we probably don't really, we need to get off of Jeff's little thing about do the laws of man apply or the laws of Earth apply outside of Earth. It's more as long as the actors are here on Earth. So I guess we don't need to concern ourselves until, say, there's a breakaway republic on Mars, and one would be enough. And but let's say a breakaway republic on Europa, and they say we're independent. And I mean, well, that story has played out in the past before, and it probably doesn't matter where it is necessarily. So. Okay, fair enough. You've convinced me I can get off of that issue. How about things like, and this might be what you were talking about, the vessel, the satellite that can repair other satellites. I have seen things I didn't think were real, and they are real. Methods by which we would try to protect Earth from asteroid, or I guess at that point they'd be a meteorite strike. Or no, maybe they'd still be a meteor or an asteroid. I'm not exactly sure what the distinction is. I'm not sure anyone does. And I actually saw something where like there was a design of a satellite. I think the French had designed it, and it literally had a giant sail or a giant net on it to catch it. Which, I mean, I guess is not the worst idea in the world. However, if you have a giant net on something, you can catch somebody else's satellite too. There is that dual use, but I guess the answer is the same. It's let's just say it is France, and let's say it's Jeffzikistan, and it's a U.S. satellite. They're both on Earth. Same rules apply. They're subject to international law here on Earth. I guess that's the long and the short of the answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be international law, and it's going to, at some point, it slips over into, when we talk about the UN Charter, we're really talking about this notion of the use of force, right? And that is when a state can resort to force. But once that force has been employed and we're in military conflict, you move over into the law of armed conflict, right? Which is more about the operations, right? Kind of a question of what you can and cannot blow up. But yeah, I mean, there's this deep question about what kind of technologies can we allow, and honestly, the Outer Space Treaty and the UN Charter are very permissive in this sense, right? The Outer Space Treaty explicitly bans weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons from being stationed in orbit. That is your only prohibition in orbit. It goes a step further on celestial bodies. So on the moon, you can't have any weapons, right? No military on the moon and other celestial bodies, but in orbit, there seems to be this recognition. No military, no weapons on the moon.
So you couldn't have, let's just say there's 30 people there. You couldn't have one sheriff with a firearm or a taser.
So it's actually very specific to military, not police. Military now, and I actually think I'm gonna say this. I'm not positive on this. That there might be a question as to whether or not weapons there applies to something like a personal firearm, or whether they mean something more, right? Whether they mean really military grade weaponry of sorts. But the goal, right, when they wrote this, it was 1967. There was this implicit idea that we're going to need to leave open this notion of conventional weapons in orbit, but it was a time of sort of optimism in international law, and they really thought that when you look out at celestial bodies, that we can make those demilitarized places. And part of this was, you really get down to one of the core goals of the Outer Space Treaty. It's to keep states from rushing in land rush to the moon, right? It is to keep the traditional source of war from going out into space to claim territory. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you see this sort of demilitarized regime adopted for the moon and their celestial bodies, which is a little crazy.
Now, I think Artemis is associated with the moon, but I think she's also a goddess of war. So I'm not really sure that the name is so great, but I'm sure I'm looking way too much into it. I spend a lot of time on mythology and Garden of Doom, less so on Garden Views, rightfully so. But if you like mythology, check out Garden of Doom. Of course, if you have Garden Views, you're already subscribed to Garden of Doom. So there we go. All right, so it may not apply to policing actions, or almost certainly doesn't. And let's be honest, whether it's a projectile weapon or a wrench, anything, or a screwdriver, anything can be a weapon and probably has deadly effect in environments such as the moon or Mars or a space shuttle or the International Space Station, or anything that we can imagine, right about now, until we get to like Star Trek level stuff. If that's ever possible, there's no place where even a Swiss Army knife couldn't be considered a weapon of mass destruction, at least on a personal level.
Well, I mean, you're actually getting to one of the the core debates are in this area is because there's a movement. There's a movement to we need to ban, right? We need law that actually begins to address the notion of weapons in the space domain, right? And there are different pathways that this is taking place on. But one of the core stumbling blocks has always been, well, how do you define a weapon, right? What is a space weapon? Is it, a ground-to-space missile that is kinetic? Is that a space weapon? Is it something in space that shoots down to the surface of Earth? Is it space to space? And that's just the function, right? Again, right, that example, or to astroscale technology. Is that weapons, right? The Soviets actually accused the United States of deploying a weapon when they put up the space shuttle with an arm in it, because the Soviets said that arm could grab a satellite and that would be the weapon, right? And that arm did, right? It went up and grabbed Hubble at one point and worked on Hubble. And weirdly, China recently put something over the robotic arm, and some brilliant person in the U.S. military was like, well, that's a weapon, right? And so what is a space weapon is a huge stumbling block when you're thinking about doing this in terms of a legal agreement, because, well, you want to be clear about what's being banned, and that is a very difficult thing to write down in a definition.
Sure, a baseball bat. I mean, somebody wants to bring their local baseball bat with them. I mean, that's a weapon, or it's not. But yeah, you can definitely see where that you'd have to have very technical language about what counts as a tool. But if it's used in this case, then it's turned into a weapon. What's a keepsake? What's a collectible? But if you use it this way, it's X. It's probably.
Well, let me take you on a quick aside, because an actual shotgun you sight on the Soyuz. It was this crazy gun that I believe had an over-under shotgun and rifle barrel, and a flare gun as well. Mm-hmm. And it rode on the Soyuz because the Soyuz used to land in the middle of Siberia, and wolves were real cosmonauts waiting for the helicopter. We got GPS, and this kind of went away. I don't think it flies on Soyuz anymore. But like NASA astronauts, when they first began to ride the Soyuz up the ISS, would actually have to get trained with this gun. And NASA was very careful to never let pictures get taken of astronauts training with the Soyuz gun.
Is it different than a regular? I mean, was it a regular shotgun?
I think it took regular shotgun shells, but like I believe it was like this triple function. Like I went to Star City in Moscow, and it wasn't on display. Like there was a hole where it was. They were cleaning it or something. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure it was a shotgun barrel, a rifle barrel underneath, or maybe more like a pistol barrel. I don't think it was a very long gun, right? And I think it also had a flare gun attachment to it, so you could sort of fire any of these three things from it. But no, it wasn't just like the 20 gauge that you can pick up at Walmart. It was crafted for space. It had to look cool.
Right, but the purpose, as they said, was to scare away wolves if they landed in Siberia before their pickup got there, and there were wolves or Yetis or something surrounding them.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, we're on this tangent now. When was the Space Museum in Moscow? Right, they had this display up, and it was the cosmonauts next to the Soyuz on the ground camping out. They built a campfire. You can see, like, they put a wolf kind of in the woods looking at them, right? Like, This was a real threat.
Okay. I'd be afraid of wolves too. And listen, it's easy to say, well, just stay in the ship. No, we've been cramped up for however long. We don't want to stay in the ship. We want to breathe some air. We want to. Maybe there wasn't even oxygen left in the ship. Anyway, it's complicated. Even simple things make it complicated. So you said I got to one of the core debates. Are there any other core? I mean, I'm sure there are, but are there other core debates that I wouldn't necessarily stumble upon or don't know about related to this topic?
Yeah. So I mean, I use this quote a lot, but this Canadian diplomat Paul Meyer once wrote this article. It's I'm guess 6, 7, 8 years old now, and at the beginning of it, he says, if aliens were to land on Earth tomorrow, which is a fascinating way to begin your space security article, because they'd be really stumped. Because every state in the world is saying that space weapons are really bad and we need to do something about it, yet nothing is getting done. And part of this is because you've got the United States, Russia, and China, who are all kind of happy with status quo. And they like to give service to, hey, we should change things, but they've all sort of taken opposing views on how they should change it. So China and Russia insist that whatever needs to be done to be a legally binding agreement. And they've actually put a draft treaty for the Conference on Disarmament. Now, put it for the Conference on Disarmament because they know that the Conference on Disarmament isn't going to get anything done. Due to the way that the process works, it's essentially deadlocked and has been for 25, 26 years now. The United States, on the other hand, is adamantly opposed to a legally binding agreement. They have recently shifted into this thing where they support the idea that we can develop norms of responsibility, right? And this idea that we can have normative growth without legally binding. And so they don't want something legally binding. And this dynamic between the debate between legally binding and not legally binding has become the proxy on which these three states really jam up the debate. And to take it even a step further, right, the United States and the UK have taken this idea of responsible behavior in space, right, which to a native English speaker just sounds about as benign as you can get, right? We should all be responsible in our day-to-day lives. China is like, no, you can't use that word. And as best as I can tell, right, from my conversations, is that they're opposed to that word because they think that this is a Western ideal of responsible behavior, and they reject that. And so by rejecting the word, they rejected the normative construct that sits with it. So at the heart of this debate is the three main players don't want the needle to move, yet they all kind of need it to move because they're getting closer and closer to a place where this conflict boils over into space, and that's bad for all of them.
Is there not a Chinese synonym for responsible that doesn't have the same Western connotation?
I actually I want to have that conversation, but I need to have it offline when I see somebody in person, so I haven't been able to have it yet. Okay. There's got to be, right? There's got to be this notion that just in your day-to-day life, right, you need to be a responsible person. And if you're not a responsible person, you might have liability for what you cause.
Yeah, I would think so. So, yeah, Artemis is a goddess of nature, but yeah, she's also the hunt and sudden death and archery. So it's not this is not all entirely peace and I mean I understand for like a hunter gatherer or omnivorous society she's useful, but I'm not sure if it was the right pick. But she is there, and there are in fact synonyms or other Greek goddesses that are associated with the moon, but I don't know. Whatever. I'm getting caught up in that. But
I think they chose her because she's Apollo's sister.
Well, she is. It's true. You're right about that.
And I think that the notion was, well, this parallelism to the Apollo missions by choosing his sister. Doesn't bring anything. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Olympians, they're all related, right? Okay, so you cited that article where that gentleman started off with a very interesting premise. Of course, my first reaction was, if the aliens come down here, I'm not really sure that that's what they're going to be dumbfounded about. They probably have other
They're diving right into the diplomacy. That's what they're going to do.
Right, exactly. Right, the granular aspects of it. Is there any serious conversation regarding space security, or at all really, about extraterrestrial life that's sort of above, Paramecian level?
I mean, there's conversation. I don't know how serious I would call it. But there are people that work on this. There's actually a really interesting scholar at Durham that works on the legal aspects of SETI as well as UAPs and what that means. And I'm pretty sure his name is Michael Bolander, fascinating scholar. I'm pretty sure that he has written a book on the law of armed conflict as it would apply to engaging with aliens.
Well, you know what I'm going to ask you
But
next. I'm going to ask if you can, maybe get him on the show. But
I gave you his email address. He might do it for you.
okay, listen, that's as good as I can get. That's fine. So what is it? I mean, obviously he's doing work on it, but is it? I imagine it's low down on the list of governmental priorities, but I could also see it as being an excuse, sort of like the wolves were not an excuse, but they could have sort of been an excuse. If somebody wanted to go up there and say, well, we need weapons just in case the little green men aren't so little and they're not exactly men, and they're not friendly. We need something to defend ourselves. It's irresponsible to send our people and our treasure up there without some form of defense. I mean, somebody's going to make that argument at some point.
I mean, I suppose so. I will say this isn't an area that I remotely keep up with. I know that it's talked about and that people deal with it, but I mean, look, I think it depends a lot on where you're going, right? Like our near term is the moon, if we actually make it there, and we know what's up there, right? Maybe those tardigrades that got sent on that one lander have gotten big or something, but there's nothing that you need to defend yourself from up there, unless it's other people. And I think we'll find the same thing in Mars. So like yeah, somebody might make that argument, but in the near midterm, probably even to the long term, I don't think that we're seeing that as something that we actually have to be concerned about.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Tardigrades.
Oh yeah, there you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that could be fun. I mean, not for the astronaut or the scientist or whatnot. Is there anything that's more serious than Teenage Mutant Ninja Tardigrades that I should have asked you about, or any topics on this that I didn't ask you about, or you didn't get a chance to expand upon or touch on?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we went through pretty much everything. I mean, I think the question that I would pose, or maybe leave your listeners with is think about how much space impacts your life on a day-to-day basis, and then think about the fact that we don't really have good rules that protect that we essentially are dependent on states having just restraint in that domain, and that when you think about something like the war in Ukraine and Starlink's fall involved, how quickly that can actually degrade on us. And so I think that's the main concern, right? Is that it degrades really quickly when you get to a shooting war, and putting in mechanisms of restraint, whether those are law, whether they're strategy, whether they're policy, whether they're just cooperation agreements among states, is a really important thing, because it can impact that is global in nature.
Like I said, there's a growing problem of what private actors can do. I'm afraid about Starlink is a private company, so one person had made a decision which was able to impact part of that conflict for a period of time, and they didn't do anything wrong. One can argue about the morals or the et cetera, or the judgment, but it's their company, it's their stuff. They had all the licenses to put it up. They were probably all rushed through because everyone on the world wants the internet everywhere, and he's putting it up there. But he also gets to tip his finger on the scale based on whatever his whims were, or his judgment was, or his decision was. And maybe there needs to be something more in the licensing regime, and the regulation says, no, you're not allowed to do that. Once you go into space, you you don't get to just play by your own rules. You have to play by some universally accepted or globally accepted principle of rules.
I mean, in all fairness, right? I don't think it was just SpaceX doing what look, initially, right? Like Elon's tweeting things and doing things. At the end of the day, though, the United States had a heavy hand in making sure that SpaceX was there, and
Exactly.
school here, but I'm pretty sure there's some subsidizing.
Oh yeah, that's sort of my point.
By the U.S. So again, I mean, it's not just Elon's like, oh, I'm going to do it. It was in conjunction with the state. I mean, but I think the thing that is important to recognize is that Starlink turned itself into a military target at that point. At that point, if Russia had struck Starlink, the question from a law of armed conflict standpoint would be, was it a legitimate target? And in my mind, if the Ukrainian military was using Starlink for any comms, it is a legitimate target. But once you start striking Starlink, right, like, you've degraded space pretty quickly, because that's going to cause a massive chain reaction.
So it's not as simple. He might have had a point on a even a bigger scale than regional war, as big as that regional war is. Although nobody knew it was going to be a regional war at the time. I guess we still don't know if it'll stay a regional war. But I guess there was a point that he didn't want to make that become a military target, because that could start a domino effect on lots and lots of satellites.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think that, yeah, I don't know that was in their process at the very beginning. I think that it slowly occurred as they got deeper in that, because at some point Russia said, "Hey, we think those are targets." Mm-hmm. At the same time, right? Russia doesn't want to degrade space either. And so there's that restraint, but that restraint is there because they don't want to degrade space, or they don't think that targeting Starlink is going to give them the benefit that they want. And there are lots of reasons to think that, right? Targeting Starlink could draw the US in, and that probably is not going to be a benefit to the Russian military. So yeah, I mean, it's not straightforward. It's very complex when we think about these things. But I'm a lawyer, and so from a legal perspective, nobody's done anything wrong by Starlink going in. It just complicates the math when we think about it from a targeting perspective and what is a lawful target. It also complicates the math when we think about, well, what should this private actor be authorized to do?
Well, you made an example earlier about when you were younger and you had 4 roommates. One of those roommates was a guest on this show a few years ago on the Longshoremen's Act and the Jones Act. I won't say which of the guests it was, because there were 2. And I'll never forget, when we were younger, he's a lawyer as well, and he said, you got to make an argument for your clients. And, if you were representing Russia, you got to make an argument. And sometimes the argument emerges after the act, and sometimes it was thought of beforehand. And the time you have to make the argument, isn't necessarily contemporaneous with the act. So, excellent point, counselor. Okay. I'd love to get more into aliens and stuff like that, but obviously that's not really for a serious discussion for you and I. Maybe for that other professor, because I am interested in scholarship on that, of course, and people taking it seriously. But it's there's phases, until we actually get the Independence Day, movie scene. That's, I'm sure, way down the hierarchy of needs list when it comes to space law and the space economy. And some of it is just, like you said, if we get back to the moon, if we do that, there's still a lot of ifs. There's not necessarily whens. And as many of other guests have pointed out, space is not exactly friendly to the human body. So
very bad for it.
Yeah. So, and we had an astrobiologist on a couple of episodes back, and yeah, I mean, we're not sure if there could be a human baby birthed in space, or another celestial body and if they would survive, and if or I mean any of it, none of it, and of course you can't do that kind of testing. I mean, it's it's the stuff of horror movies, where horror and science fiction meet. So there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of ifs. But I think you very much did help clarify what is the situation on space and on the ground, how the UN Charter fits in both legally and practically, and sort of the constraints and the restraints. And in some ways, it made me rethink that episode over Ukraine, and it also made me rethink that this interconnectivity, including the space economy and the space cooperation, may in its own way be restraining the expansion of that war. And if that war can be restrained, as awful as it is, you think most others would as well, because that's probably about as explosive, likelihood to turn into a world war as any conflict. I mean, most conflicts tend to be regional, but whenever you get, a land war in Europe, at least in our last 150 years, it tends to blow up, so to speak.
They go a certain way.
Yeah, they go a certain way, or they have so far. All right. If you want to be followed and found, or do you have any books to sell, or are you doing anything exciting where there's grants or anything that you would like us to know about?
Sure. I'll choose 3 plugs. You can find me on Twitter. Not really tweeting much of anything useful at Blount's Folly, not .com, just at Blount's Folly. If you are interested in space security, I have recently published a co-edited volume with Sadia Pekkanen at the University of Washington, and it is the Oxford Handbook of Space Security. We had, I think, 40 or 50 authors on that. I think it's 44 chapters, and so it's well worth a read. I think it's a pretty definitive text on this particular topic, and it's not just law; it's strategy. It's the whole beast. And then I'll give one more. I published a book in 2019, which is called Reprogramming the World. It's all about cyberspace, but it's free to download. And if you go download it, you don't have to read it. It makes a little ticker go up on the publisher's website, and that makes me feel really good. So, download it often.
Okay. Well, what was that, the title again?
Reprogramming the World.
Reprogramming the World. Okay. And where can they find it?
You Google me, it's at International Relations Press is where you'll find it. But if you just Google my name and the title of the book, it'll take you there.
Okay. Well, Google, your name was PJ Blount, Blount. In case you meet more than one, he is a assistant professor of space law at Durham, and previously at Cardiff. So, I mean, if that's not enough identifiers to figure out which PJ Blount it is, then then you probably couldn't read the book anyway. All right. Thank you very much, Professor, for being on again. I may call upon you in the future, who knows, but I appreciate your participation and the work, and thank you very much for humoring me on some of my more afar scenarios.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was good to be back. Right. I just hope I was coherent.
You were definitely coherent. There were times when it got scratchy, but it would clear up. And I hope it was clear enough for the audience, but sometimes I made you repeat yourself on key points that I thought might have been too scratchy for the audience to hear. So I apologize to the answer, but we are international, and I didn't want to schedule this again because he's many hours away. Okay, folks, thank you so much. Please subscribe to Garden of Doom. You get this show, Garden of Doom, and Garden of Doom presents Book of Black. Book of Black is a lot like Garden of Doom, except my co-host, different PJ Black, who formerly known as Justin Gabriel, a professional wrestler. And we talk to people in professional wrestling, in and around professional wrestling, about Garden of Doom stuff. And I think you'd be surprised that some of those conversations are really philosophical and sort of deep. So anyway, thank you. If you're a new listener, please subscribe, and hopefully you'll give a review, like, and share. Otherwise, thanks again to our guest, and you'll hear from us again later on in the week.
Cancel it though I know it must be the killing time. cruelly you kissed me. Your lips a magic world. Your sky all hung with jewels. The killing moon will come too soon. Fate up against your will, through the thick and thin. He will wait until you give yourself